I learned something important the moment I heard steel scrape against my own front gate, because that sound told me someone had already decided my property belonged to them before I even stepped out of my truck. The smell of diesel still clung to my shirt after a 10-hour day at an equipment auction outside Tulsa, and the late afternoon sun was hanging low over the Oklahoma fields as I turned onto the familiar county road leading home. My old pickup bounced across every dip in the gravel until I rounded the final bend, expecting to see the same cedar fence, weathered mailbox, and open gate that had greeted my family for decades. Instead, I slammed on the brakes so hard that loose papers slid across the passenger seat. A thick chain wrapped tightly around my own gate reflected the sunlight like it had been there for years, even though I knew it had not been there that morning. Beyond the chain, orange survey stakes cut across the edge of my pasture. Temporary construction fencing blocked part of the driveway, and 2 white utility trucks sat where my father always parked his tractor. 6 strangers moved around my entrance as if they owned every inch of ground beneath their boots. One contractor was drilling near my cedar fence, while another unloaded metal posts from a trailer. Standing in the middle of everything was Patricia Coleman, the president of the neighboring homeowners association, holding a clipboard with the confidence of someone delivering orders instead of asking permission. She looked directly at me before I even opened my truck door. "You are late," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We have already begun securing this access point." I stepped out slowly, gravel crunching beneath my boots, trying to understand what I was seeing instead of reacting to it. "This is my entrance," I replied. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Patricia barely glanced toward the chain. She simply tapped her clipboard with a pen and said the homeowners association was exercising emergency access rights connected to community planning and that my driveway would remain restricted until further notice. Every word sounded rehearsed. Every sentence felt designed to overwhelm me before I could ask another question. My eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the gate camera mounted on the cedar post. Something immediately felt wrong. The camera had been turned slightly away from the driveway, as though someone had intentionally changed its angle. Patricia noticed where I was looking and quickly stepped between me and the gate. "There is nothing here you need to worry about," she said. I did not answer. Instead, I looked higher toward the roofline of the old barn nearly 200 feet away. Hidden beneath the edge of the metal roof was another security camera my father had installed years earlier after a series of equipment thefts in the county. Most visitors never noticed it because it blended into the shadow beneath the eaves. Patricia certainly had not. One of the contractors walked over carrying another bundle of orange stakes, while muddy red clay clung to the soles of his boots. That caught my attention because my driveway was covered in gray gravel, not red clay. He had come from somewhere else before arriving here. Patricia held out a packet of papers and told me I had 72 hours to cooperate with the homeowners association or face additional action. I never reached for the documents. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled to one name that had never failed me when staying calm mattered more than speaking loudly. Daniel Reed answered before the second ring. I kept my eyes on the chain stretched across my gate as I quietly said, "I just got home, and you are not going to believe what somebody did to my farm." Daniel did not ask a single question after hearing my voice. He simply said he was on his way, then ended the call. That was one thing I had always admired about him. He never wasted time collecting opinions before seeing facts with his own eyes. While I slipped my phone back into my pocket, Patricia continued explaining her version of reality as though the conversation had already been decided. She spoke about community improvements, future infrastructure, and emergency planning, carefully choosing words that sounded official without actually explaining why a chain had suddenly appeared across my entrance. I listened without interrupting because my father had spent years teaching me that the first person to lose patience usually became the first person to lose control. My family had owned this farm long before the subdivision behind the tree line ever existed. My grandfather bought the property in 1978 after returning from years of working cattle ranches across Oklahoma. Every fence post, every section of cedar fencing, every gravel load spread across the driveway had been built one season at a time through honest work. The weathered barn standing behind the entrance had survived tornado warnings, hailstorms, droughts, and freezing winters without moving an inch. My father often joked that the barn knew more family history than anyone still alive, because every generation had repaired the same wooden beams instead of replacing them. After he passed away, I inherited more than land. I inherited routines. Every spring I inspected the fences. Every summer I cleared brush along the property line. Every fall I checked the drainage ditch before heavy rains arrived. Inside the farmhouse, tucked beneath the staircase, stood a fireproof filing cabinet that my father insisted was just as important as any tractor parked in the equipment shed. He always told me that land was protected twice, once by fences and once by paperwork. At the time I thought he was exaggerating. Standing outside that chained gate, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Patricia held out another copy of her paperwork, but I still refused to touch it. Instead, I slowly looked across the entrance, noticing details that did not belong. Fresh tire marks crossed the gray gravel before disappearing toward the temporary fence. The contractor carrying metal posts still had thick red clay packed into the tread of his work boots, even though there was no red soil anywhere on my property. Someone had come directly from another location before arriving here. My eyes settled on the old iron boundary monument resting quietly beneath tall grass beside the driveway. Most people drove past it without noticing, but I had watched my father trim around that steel marker every summer with almost ceremonial care. He never allowed weeds to hide it for long because he believed permanent boundaries deserved permanent respect. Looking at that weathered piece of steel gave me more confidence than anything Patricia could say. It had been sitting there for decades, long before neighborhood meetings, architectural committees, or colorful planning maps ever existed. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay across the pasture, while horses lifted their heads to watch the unfamiliar activity near the entrance. Everything beyond the gate still felt peaceful, almost untouched by the argument unfolding outside. Then I heard the low rumble of a pickup truck approaching from the county road. I recognized the sound before I even saw the vehicle. Daniel's dark blue truck rolled slowly toward the entrance before stopping several yards behind mine. He climbed out without rushing, closed the door quietly, took one long look at the chain stretched across my gate, then calmly shifted his attention to Patricia without saying a single word. Daniel stopped several feet from the chained gate and quietly studied the entire entrance before speaking. He did not look impressed by the temporary fencing, the orange survey stakes, or the white utility trucks parked across my driveway. His eyes moved slowly from the fresh tire tracks in the gravel to the contractor drilling near my cedar fence, then toward the camera mounted on the gatepost that had clearly been turned away from the entrance. Finally, he glanced toward the roof of the old barn, and I noticed the smallest hint of recognition cross his face. He remembered the second camera because he had helped my father install it years earlier. Patricia stepped forward with the confidence of someone expecting immediate cooperation. She extended the same packet of papers toward Daniel and introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association before explaining that the community was exercising emergency access rights connected to future public safety improvements. Daniel accepted the packet without commenting. Instead of reading the first page immediately, he carefully examined every sheet until he reached the signature page. He looked up at Patricia and asked a simple question in a calm, even voice. "Has this plan been recorded with the county?" Patricia answered without hesitation that the Homeowners Association Board had approved everything necessary and that construction had already been scheduled. Daniel nodded politely, but repeated the question almost word for word. "I did not ask whether your board approved it. I asked whether it has been officially recorded with the county." For the first time since I arrived home, Patricia hesitated. She glanced toward one of the contractors before replying that the recording process was still moving through administrative review and that the association had authority to begin preliminary work. Daniel folded the papers neatly and handed them back to her. "Internal approval and recorded property rights are not the same thing," he said quietly. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody argued. Even the contractors slowed what they were doing as they listened. Daniel walked toward the edge of the driveway, careful not to disturb anything. He photographed every orange survey stake, every temporary fence panel, every utility truck, and the chain wrapped tightly around my gate. He took another picture of the gate camera that had been turned away from the entrance, then one more of the old iron boundary monument nearly hidden beneath tall grass. He even photographed the contractor's muddy boots before turning his attention to the red clay stuck inside the tire tread of one utility truck. The contractor looked confused, but Daniel simply smiled politely and continued documenting the scene. Watching him work reminded me why people trusted him. During his years in the Marine Corps, he learned that observations mattered more than assumptions. He never argued against opinions when facts could speak for themselves later. Patricia attempted to regain control of the conversation by explaining that the neighborhood needed a second emergency exit because additional homes were planned beyond the current subdivision. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he asked another short question. "Can you show us the recorded easement that authorizes vehicle access across this property?" Patricia opened her folder, flipped through several pages, then produced a large color planning map filled with bright lines and shaded sections. She pointed confidently toward my driveway and explained that the highlighted corridor represented future access connecting the subdivision to the county road. Daniel studied the map for several quiet seconds before folding his arms. "This is a planning map," he said calmly. "It shows what someone hopes will exist. It does not show what legally exists today." The afternoon breeze carried dust across the gravel as complete silence settled over the entrance. And for the first time since I had driven home, Patricia no longer looked like the person in control of the situation. Patricia straightened the stack of papers in her hands and forced another confident smile. But the rhythm of the conversation had already changed. She was no longer explaining her authority. She was trying to defend it. Daniel remained completely relaxed as he studied the colorful planning map one last time before handing it back. "Planning documents are useful," he said calmly. "Recorded property records are binding." Patricia replied that the Homeowners Association had already invested significant money preparing the future access road, and that delaying the project would create unnecessary expenses for the neighborhood. Daniel nodded respectfully. "Investment does not change ownership," he answered. "If someone spends money based on the wrong assumption, that does not transfer another person's land." The contractors quietly exchanged glances but continued standing beside their equipment, uncertain whether they should keep working. The afternoon breeze carried dust across the gravel driveway, while my horses remained gathered behind the pasture fence, watching every unfamiliar movement near the entrance. I realized the entire farm seemed to be holding its breath. Patricia finally pointed toward the temporary fencing and announced that the work would continue unless a court ordered otherwise. Daniel did not argue. Instead, he asked whether anyone had physically located the original easement markers before placing the orange stakes. Patricia answered that professional planning consultants had already determined the proper location. Daniel simply looked toward me and smiled slightly. "That is not the same answer," he said quietly. He walked over to the old iron boundary monument that stood almost hidden beneath tall grass beside the driveway. Kneeling carefully, he brushed away loose dirt and weeds with nothing more than his hand until the weathered steel cap became visible again. The monument had remained untouched for decades, quietly marking the same corner through storms, droughts, and changing property around it. Daniel photographed it from every angle before standing again. "Permanent monuments usually tell a more reliable story than temporary stakes," he said. Patricia crossed her arms and insisted that the Homeowners Association survey was accurate. Daniel politely asked for a copy of the licensed surveyor's recorded field notes. She admitted she did not have them available. He then requested the recording number assigned by the county clerk. Again, no answer came. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. I suddenly remembered another conversation from nearly 5 years earlier. Patricia had visited my farmhouse carrying homemade cookies and a friendly smile, asking whether I would consider selling a narrow 30-foot strip along my entrance because the neighborhood might someday need additional access. I declined without much thought because my father had always warned me never to divide the entrance to working farmland. She accepted my decision politely and never mentioned it again. At least that was what I believed until now. Looking at the chain wrapped around my gate, the temporary fencing, and the planning map in her hands, I realized this had probably never been a spontaneous project. It looked more like the continuation of a conversation that had started years before. Daniel quietly walked back toward me and lowered his voice enough that only I could hear him. "Do not touch the chain," he said. "Do not move a single stake. Right now, everything is evidence exactly where they left it." His advice went against every instinct I had. Every part of me wanted to remove the chain from my own gate and drive home like any ordinary evening. Instead, I took one slow breath and watched Daniel continue photographing every detail while the setting sun stretched long shadows across the gravel. Whatever story Patricia wanted everyone else to believe, Daniel had already begun collecting the facts that would eventually tell a very different one. The last contractor packed away his drill just before sunset, not because anyone had ordered him to stop, but because uncertainty had settled over the entrance like the evening air. Patricia finally gathered her papers, reminded me that the Homeowners Association expected my cooperation, and climbed into her sport utility vehicle without another explanation. One by one, the utility trucks rolled away, leaving the temporary fencing, the orange survey stakes, and the heavy chain exactly where they had been placed. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural after the noise of engines and construction equipment. Daniel waited until every vehicle disappeared beyond the bend in the county road before speaking again. "Now we work," he said. We entered the farm through a secondary field entrance that connected to an old service lane my father rarely used. As we drove across the pasture, the setting sun cast long golden shadows over the weathered barn and the grazing horses, making it difficult to believe that only a few hundred feet away someone had attempted to redefine the entrance to property my family had cared for over 3 generations. Inside the farmhouse, Daniel removed his boots, washed the dust from his hands, and cleared the large oak dining table where my father had once balanced farm ledgers every winter. Within minutes, the tabletop filled with folders, envelopes, tax records, surveys, and warranty deeds pulled carefully from the old fireproof filing cabinet beneath the staircase. Every document had been organized by my father using handwritten labels that suddenly seemed far more valuable than I had ever appreciated. Daniel read each page slowly instead of searching for quick answers. He compared dates, recording numbers, survey stamps, and county references with the patience of someone assembling a puzzle that had only one correct solution. After nearly an hour, he stopped at a folded document dated 1981. "Here it is," he said quietly. It was an easement agreement recorded decades earlier, exactly as Patricia had suggested. For a brief moment, my stomach tightened because I wondered if she had actually been telling the truth all along. Daniel continued reading until he reached the legal description, then placed his finger beneath one sentence and slid the document across the table. The easement granted access for an underground water utility corridor measuring only 8 feet in width. It said nothing about vehicle traffic, construction equipment, neighborhood roads, or emergency exits. We compared that description against Patricia's colorful planning map from memory. The difference was impossible to ignore. Someone had taken a narrow underground utility easement and transformed it into a proposed roadway nearly 30 feet wide. Daniel leaned back in his chair without celebrating. "They found one small piece of truth," he said calmly. "Then they built a much bigger story around it." Before I could answer, he opened the security system on my computer and selected the camera mounted beneath the barn roof. The video began hours before I arrived home. We watched Patricia step from her vehicle while directing contractors toward the entrance. She pointed repeatedly at my driveway before one worker rotated the gate camera away from the road. Another unloaded the chain from the back of a truck while a third positioned the orange survey stakes exactly where we had found them. Then Patricia said something that made both of us pause the recording. She looked at the crew leader and said, "Finish before the owner gets back. It will be much harder once he is standing here." Daniel quietly saved multiple copies of the footage onto separate storage drives before closing the computer. The room fell silent except for the ticking clock my grandfather had hung on the kitchen wall decades earlier. The chain outside my gate no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It looked like part of a carefully planned schedule that depended on me arriving home too late to stop the first move. The next morning began before sunrise, long before the neighborhood behind my farm came to life. Thin fog drifted across the pasture while dew covered the cedar fence and the gravel driveway beyond the chained gate. Nothing had changed overnight. The temporary fencing still blocked the entrance. The orange survey stakes remained exactly where they had been planted, and the heavy chain still hung across the gate, as though someone believed enough hours could transform possession into ownership. Daniel arrived carrying 2 large storage boxes instead of coffee. He placed them on the dining table and smiled. "Today we organize," he said. "Facts become stronger when they are easy to follow." For the next several hours, we built a complete timeline beginning with the day my grandfather purchased the property in 1978. Every warranty deed, every county tax receipt, every license survey, every utility agreement, and every annual property assessment was arranged in chronological order. My father had written notes in the margins of several folders, carefully documenting repairs to fences, drainage improvements, and conversations with county officials over the years. One handwritten note immediately caught Daniel's attention because it referenced a request from 1996 asking to expand the existing utility easement. My father had written only one sentence beneath the date. Request respectfully declined because farm access must remain under owner control. Daniel placed a yellow marker beside the note without saying anything. After finishing the paperwork, we drove into town to visit Laura Bennett, a local real estate attorney who had handled agricultural property issues throughout the county for many years. She carefully reviewed the easement agreement, the warranty deeds, the planning documents Patricia had presented, and the video from the barn camera. She remained quiet until she finished reading every page. Then she looked directly at both of us and explained that the recorded easement clearly authorized only an underground water utility corridor measuring 8 feet in width. It did not authorize road construction, vehicle traffic, temporary fencing, or restrictions preventing the owner from entering his own property. She also pointed out something Daniel had already suspected. The colorful planning map carried no county recording number because it was only an internal proposal rather than a legally recorded property document. Laura immediately agreed to prepare a formal preservation notice requiring the homeowners association to avoid altering the entrance until ownership questions were fully reviewed. Before leaving town, Daniel contacted Robert Hayes, a licensed land surveyor whose reputation extended across several counties. Robert agreed to inspect the property the following morning with modern surveying equipment while also comparing current measurements against the original recorded survey. On our drive back to the farm, Daniel finally mentioned something that had been bothering him since the previous afternoon. "The red clay," he said quietly. "It does not belong on your driveway." We returned to the entrance and examined the tire tracks again. The red clay remained pressed into the gravel exactly where the utility truck had been parked. Daniel photographed every track from multiple angles before placing small reference markers nearby without disturbing anything. As the afternoon faded into evening, an envelope arrived in my mailbox from the homeowners association. Inside was another formal notice accusing me of interfering with community improvements and warning that additional legal action could follow if I refused to cooperate. I read every line slowly before handing the letter to Daniel. He slipped it neatly into the growing evidence folder without showing the slightest sign of frustration. "Good," he said with complete confidence. "Every time they put their position in writing, they help us understand exactly where their story begins and exactly where it will eventually fall apart." Robert Hayes arrived just after 8 o'clock the following morning with a white survey truck carrying modern measuring equipment, tripods, and bright orange instrument cases that looked far more professional than the temporary stakes scattered across my entrance. Unlike the contractors who had appeared without warning, Robert introduced himself, showed his state surveyor identification, and explained every step before unloading a single piece of equipment. Daniel appreciated that immediately. Respect for procedure recognized respect for property. Before Robert began measuring, Daniel handed him copies of the original recorded survey, the warranty deed, and the 1981 easement agreement. Robert spent nearly 20 minutes reading the legal descriptions before walking toward the old iron boundary monument beside the driveway. He brushed away the remaining grass with a small hand tool, examined the weathered survey cap, and smiled. "This monument has not moved," he said. "That is exactly what I was hoping to find." Hearing those words felt like taking a full breath after holding it for 2 days. Robert carefully positioned his equipment over the monument and began collecting measurements that extended across the entrance, the pasture, and the property line. Every coordinate appeared instantly on his electronic display while Daniel quietly photographed the process without interrupting. The temporary orange stakes placed by the homeowners association remained untouched several yards away, standing like silent guesses beside professionally verified measurements. Around mid-morning, Patricia arrived with 2 members of the homeowners association board. She stepped out carrying the same colorful planning map, but this time her confidence seemed noticeably smaller. She approached Robert and politely asked whether he could suspend his work until the association completed its own review. Robert answered without emotion that he had been hired to verify recorded property boundaries using official county records, and that his responsibility was to complete the survey exactly as licensed by the state. Patricia then turned toward Daniel and suggested that everyone could avoid unnecessary legal expenses if I simply agreed to allow temporary access until future improvements were finalized. Daniel looked at her calmly before replying with the same steady tone he had maintained since arriving at my farm. Temporary access to land you do not own is still access to land you do not own. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. Patricia looked frustrated but said nothing more. She returned to her vehicle and remained there while Robert continued working throughout the afternoon. By early evening, the preliminary measurements were complete. Robert spread several printed diagrams across the hood of his survey truck and carefully compared them with the original recorded plat. He traced one line with his finger before looking directly at me. The legal utility easement measured exactly 8 feet across the edge of my property, just as the 1981 document described. The temporary fencing installed by the Homeowners Association extended more than 20 feet beyond that recorded easement, crossing directly into my private entrance. Even several of the orange survey stakes had been placed well outside the legally authorized corridor. Daniel quietly organized every photograph, every measurement, and every document into clearly labeled folders before asking Robert one final question. "Would you be willing to certify these findings?" Robert nodded without hesitation. "If these are the recorded documents, then these measurements will say exactly what the land has been saying for decades." As the sun dropped behind the oak trees, Daniel closed the final folder and placed it beside the handwritten note my father had left in 1996. For the first time since the chain appeared across my gate, we were no longer relying on memory, opinion, or promises. We were holding evidence that connected every permanent monument, every recorded document, every photograph, and every measured foot of ground into one clear story that would be very difficult for anyone to ignore. 3 days later, we walked into the county administrative hearing, carrying 2 storage boxes that looked far less impressive than the colorful presentation boards stacked beside Patricia's table. She arrived with several Homeowners Association board members, neatly printed diagrams, enlarged planning maps, and polished speeches about community growth, public safety, and future development. Daniel placed our evidence on the table without saying a word. Every folder carried a handwritten label. Every photograph matched a document. Every document matched a recorded date. Every recorded date matched a survey. Looking at the 2 tables side by side, I realized one side depended on presentation while the other depended on records. The hearing began with Patricia explaining that the neighborhood required a secondary emergency exit to support future expansion and improve safety for residents. She displayed the same colorful map I had already seen beside my gate and described the proposed roadway as a reasonable extension of an existing utility easement. Several people in the room nodded politely because, without additional context, her explanation sounded organized and responsible. Then Laura Bennett stood and requested permission to present the recorded documents in chronological order. She began with the original warranty deed from 1978 before introducing the recorded easement agreement from 1981. She carefully read the legal description confirming that the easement authorized only an underground water utility corridor measuring 8 feet in width. Nothing in the document mentioned roadway construction, vehicle traffic, neighborhood access, or temporary occupation of private property. Robert Hayes then presented his certified survey. Using enlarged aerial photographs and precise measurements, he demonstrated that the temporary fencing, the chain across my entrance, several orange survey stakes, and portions of the Homeowners Association work area extended more than 20 feet beyond the recorded easement onto my private property. The room became noticeably quieter. Laura continued by presenting the handwritten note my father had placed inside the filing cabinet in 1996, documenting a request to expand the easement that had been respectfully declined. Next came the preserved security footage from the barn camera. The recording showed contractors arriving before I returned home, rotating the gate camera away from the driveway, unloading the chain, positioning the temporary fencing, and receiving directions from Patricia. Finally, Laura introduced the Homeowners Association letter accusing me of interfering with community improvements together with the planning documents that carried no county recording number. One county official asked Patricia whether the proposed roadway had ever received formal approval as a recorded property interest. After several quiet moments, she admitted that the proposal remained part of a future development plan rather than an approved property modification. Another official asked why construction activity had begun before obtaining the necessary legal authority. Patricia attempted to explain that the Homeowners Association believed the existing utility easement provided sufficient flexibility while final approvals were being completed. Daniel never interrupted. He simply opened the final folder and placed one photograph beside the certified survey. It showed the old iron boundary monument exactly where Robert had confirmed it remained after decades. Daniel quietly said, "Permanent monuments and recorded documents have been agreeing with each other for many years." No one challenged that statement. After a brief private discussion, the county officials returned with their decision. The existing utility easement remained valid only within its recorded 8-foot corridor. The temporary fencing, chain, survey stakes, and any work extending beyond that corridor had no legal authorization. The Homeowners Association was directed to remove every unauthorized obstruction, restore the entrance to its previous condition, and suspend all roadway activity unless future approvals were properly recorded through the required legal process. As we stepped outside the courthouse, Daniel looked at the 2 storage boxes we had carried in that morning and smiled quietly. "Your father organized those files for decades," he said. "Today they finally had their chance to speak for him." The chain disappeared from my gate 2 days after the county hearing. I watched the same contractors who had installed the temporary fencing carefully remove every panel, load every metal post back onto their trailers, and pull each orange survey stake from the ground one by one. Nobody argued. Nobody rushed. They simply restored the entrance to the condition they had found it before driving away. When the last truck disappeared down the county road, I stood quietly beside the old iron boundary monument while the evening breeze moved through the pasture exactly as it had every summer since I was a boy. The gravel driveway stretched toward the farmhouse without a single obstacle standing between the road and home. It looked ordinary again, and somehow that ordinary view meant more than any dramatic victory ever could. A week later, I received a formal letter confirming that the Homeowners Association had withdrawn its notices concerning my property and acknowledged the county's determination regarding the recorded easement. Laura Bennett called to tell me the matter had been officially closed unless someone attempted to file a completely new application through the proper legal process. She also reminded me to keep every document together because good records protect future generations just as much as they protect current owners. After hanging up the phone, I walked to the fireproof filing cabinet beneath the staircase and carefully returned every survey, photograph, certified measurement, court paper, tax receipt, and security recording to its proper folder. My father had spent decades organizing those files even when nothing unusual was happening. I finally understood that preparation was not something you did after trouble arrived. Preparation was the quiet habit that made the truth easier to prove when trouble eventually found you. Daniel stopped by the farm that evening carrying nothing except 2 paper cups of coffee. We sat on the tailgate of my pickup overlooking the entrance while the horses grazed peacefully beyond the cedar fence. The chain was gone. The temporary fencing was gone. The planning maps had become nothing more than paper stored in someone else's office. The only things still standing were the old gate, the weathered barn, the oak trees, and the iron boundary monument that had quietly told the same story through every season. Daniel looked toward the entrance and smiled before saying something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. "I never saved your farm," he said. "Your grandfather protected it when he placed that monument. Your father protected it when he kept those records. All I did was help everyone else see what had already been true for decades." I looked across the pasture and realized he was exactly right. The real hero had never been one dramatic moment. It had been years of careful decisions that nobody noticed until they suddenly mattered. Since then, I have added one new tradition to the farm. Every January, I inspect the property lines, update copies of every recorded document, test every security camera, and place fresh backups inside the fireproof cabinet. It takes only a few hours each year, But those hours remind me that ownership is more than holding a deed. It is accepting responsibility for preserving the truth that comes with it. Every time I drive through that gate now, I still glance at the old iron boundary monument before heading toward the barn. It reminds me that justice is not always loud, and it does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes justice waits quietly inside a filing cabinet, inside a weathered survey marker, inside an overlooked security camera, and inside the discipline to remain patient while facts do the work that anger never could. The entrance to my farm looks exactly the way it did before all of this began, but every time I hear gravel beneath my tires, I remember that the strongest boundary I own is not the fence running beside the road. It is the truth that stood there long before anyone tried to move it.